Hi, how's it going? It seems like most camera manufacturers are moving away from making cheaper point-and-shoot cameras and consumer camcorders. I suspect this is due in large part to the prevalence of smartphones. These days, most folks already have a camera in their pocket most of the time. However, all one has to do is search camera or camcorder on Amazon to see that there still appears to be a demand for inexpensive cameras. The sheer number of listings is staggering. Unfortunately, these listings are almost exclusively generic cameras, made as cheaply as possible and advertised with misleading and often outright false claims. The ads are also full of highly suspect reviews, though fake reviews on Amazon could be an entire video on its own. In most cases, I think buying used or saving up and getting something nicer is the far better way to go. But if you want something new for around $200 or less, then generic cameras like this are the only commonly available option right now. So, what can you expect from a camera like this? This is the Ordro G700, and it looks a bit like a Canon DSLR, complete with the red ring on the lens, like Canon L lenses have. I thought the motorized rotating camera on the Ordro M3 was the most pointlessly motorized feature ever, but this camera beats it handily, with the most hilariously pointless motorized action. When powered up, the lens extends slightly. It's totally pointless. I know some cameras do this in order to move the lens elements from a more compact position to one ready for operation, but this camera doesn't do that. It moves the entire lens module outward for no reason at all. My guess is that it's because other cameras do this, and their camera will feel more legitimate if it does it too. Seriously, it's like aliens make these cameras and have no idea what cameras are, but they're pretty sure this part extends on some of them, so they make this one extend too for no reason. What a thing to waste money on. The camera itself appears to have the same lens guts as the AC5 and other optical zoom camcorders, and that lens assembly is pretty small, and the zoom and focus is all internal, so this lens extension is totally unnecessary. Not to mention the extra size that it requires to make it do that in the first place. I'll take this camera apart at the end, and we'll have a look inside. I guess this is also a good time to point out how ridiculously oversized and overweight this camera is for what it is. Maybe they think it'll make it look more like a real camera if it looks like a large DSLR. But DSLR cameras are large because they have large sensors, and a mechanical shutter, and an optical through-the-lens viewfinder with a flipping prism mirror system. This camera has none of that. It's an extremely basic, small sensor, point-and-shoot camera that doesn't even have image stabilization. Name brand, point-and-shoot small sensor cameras with similar zoom and better features are a tiny fraction of the size and weight. This Ordro is larger and heavier than some full-frame cameras. It just feels silly to lug around a camera this big and heavy for the capabilities it offers. Unfortunately, name brand point-and-shoot cameras are becoming increasingly difficult to find, if you can find them at all, and most were originally released 6 to 8 years ago. And that's the main reason for this video. Camera companies just aren't making small sensor point-and-shoot cameras anymore, while cameras like this Ordro are flooding the market. In addition to trying to look like something they aren't, another thing you have to get used to with these generic cameras is taking all of their claims with a block of salt. For instance, this G700 says it has image stabilization, but like many of their camcorders, it simply doesn't work. Nothing more to really say about that. Image stabilization does nothing in photos or videos. It advertises 64 megapixel photos and even says so right on the camera, despite proudly claiming that it has an 8 megapixel Sony sensor. It also claims 30x digital zoom on top of the 12x optical zoom for a combined total of 360x zoom. It has various photo modes such as shutter priority, aperture priority, scene modes, auto, and it also has manual focus and autofocus and more. It's clearly trying to be more of a photo camera or hybrid than a video camera. In fact, it doesn't even have a video mode that you can switch to. It just has a video button, and if you press that, it switches to video and starts recording, and then when you press again, it stops recording and switches back to photo mode. Autofocus in this camera seems a bit more reliable than when I experienced it in their camcorders, but maybe that's just because I didn't use photo mode very much on the camcorders, whereas I almost exclusively used photo mode on this camera. Either way, it is still slow, it hunts around a bit, and it misses focus sometimes, especially in low light, and it has other quirks. When you half press the shutter button, it will try to focus for a couple seconds, then it will give you a green focus icon, even if it totally missed focus. And you can't move the focus point, it's always in the center. It does have a manual focus mode, which actually works, but it doesn't provide any focus zoom, and there's no focus peaking or anything like that, so you are purely relying on the normal view on the screen while manually focusing. Manual focus uses the zoom rocker to adjust focus, so once you switch to manual focus, you can no longer zoom in or out. This sometimes caused frustration. I'd be trying to manually focus on a bird in the trees, and the bird would hop to another branch. I'd try to zoom out to find it again, and I couldn't without first switching back to autofocus. Then I'd find the bird, zoom back in, then switch back to manual focus to try again. It's just very clunky. If you press the autofocus and auto exposure lock button, it will actually adjust the autofocus and auto exposure automatically, even if you're in manual, then it will lock. So if either of those things misses or doesn't set where you want to, you have to unlock it and try again. There's no way to just like it how it is, press the button to lock it. When you press the button, it will automatically adjust both before locking. Also, the zoom and focus rings on this big fake lens are just that, they're fake. But hey, that's what a camera's supposed to look like, right? There's also a macro focus mode that does nothing. The focus behaves exactly the same and focuses exactly as close, whether it's in macro or not. The mode settings are also odd. Aperture priority in particular is yet another totally pointless feature. The aperture on this camera can be adjusted from f2.8 all the way to f3.1. That's it. It's so pointless. That's not even 1/3 of a stop, and I literally couldn't tell a difference. In fact, I suspect it's not actually doing anything. In fact, all of the modes are almost entirely pointless because there's no way to fully control the exposure. In manual mode, there's no way to change the ISO. It's locked in auto. You can manually change ISO in other modes, but in those modes, the shutter speed is locked in auto. So the only way to actually make the images brighter or darker is to change the exposure compensation setting, and that can only be adjusted in full stop increments. Another weird thing is that the ISO numbers are backwards. I took a pic at 100 ISO, and the camera chose 1/58th of a second shutter speed, and the image was clearly noisy and badly smeared from noise reduction, definitely at a high ISO setting. At 1600 ISO, it shows 1/2 a second shutter speed, and at 3200 ISO, it shows a full 1 second shutter. So the ISO numbers are clearly backward. I also tried all of the scene options in the scene modes. The only thing I could tell that the scene modes changed was the ISO. I took pictures in every scene mode, and they all looked exactly the same, except some of them had blur from noise reduction due to a high ISO, and some of them had blur from camera shake because of a nearly 1 second shutter time. They otherwise had all the same settings and color as far as I could tell. So that's another pointless feature. And it's the same with white balance. As with nearly all generic cameras, the auto white balance setting is the most usable overall, though it still has a magenta shift, greens look a bit brown, and browns look reddish-orange. The modes other than auto sometimes make things look a little worse, and often they make no difference whatsoever. This camera has a face detection mode, but it's only available in auto. Not that it matters much because focus and exposure remain fixed at the center point, so face detection is yet another totally pointless feature. All it does is occasionally draw a box around faces or random shapes it thinks might be faces. It otherwise does nothing. It really feels like this camera was designed by someone who had no idea what a camera was, then someone handed them a few pictures of a camera and said, build one of these as cheaply as possible, but make sure it superficially looks the same so we can sell it. It looks like a camera, and it has some of the modes and features a camera would normally have, but they are either entirely pointless, operate backward to what they should, or just don't function at all. This camera has a hump in the middle where you would expect to find a viewfinder, but it's just a hump because, hey, that's what a camera's supposed to look like, right? That's the shape it's supposed to be. Operation overall is slow and clunky. Going back and forth from this to a cheap point-and-shoot from over a decade ago is like night and day, with the Ordro being just frustrating and slow to use by comparison. It takes several seconds at a minimum for each picture, and maybe more depending on how long it takes to acquire focus. If you take a picture and want to quickly take a follow-up shot, forget it. You have to wait until it's ready, and if you push the shutter button before that, nothing happens. It does have a continuous shooting mode, but it's really just a 3-shot burst mode, assuming you would call roughly 1 picture a second a burst. In that mode, when you press the shutter button, it focuses 1 time, then takes approximately 1 picture a second for about 3 seconds. I didn't measure the amount of zoom this camera has, but it has enough optical zoom that I'm not going to worry whether it's exactly 12 or not. But it also claims to have 30x digital zoom for a combined total of 360x zoom, and that's just a lie. I would guess the digital zoom is maybe 1.2x. The digital zoom does barely anything. No zoom at all. Max optical zoom. Max digital zoom. That's it. No digital zoom. Maximum digital zoom. Is that 360x, you think? Considering how poor the image is to begin with, I can't imagine benefiting from digital zoom anyway, but it's just another of those silly claims that I don't think is unfair to call a lie at this point. All in all, the camera is extremely clunky and slow to operate with confusing modes, features that don't work, settings that don't adjust, settings that operate backwards, a manual mode that isn't, and outright lies about features and specs. But how's the image quality? I'll start by covering video. The video is over-sharpened with boosted contrast. It looks a bit unnatural, but it does give a punchy first impression. However, there are a lot of issues. It has bad rolling shutter, has no image stabilization, and it has the same terrible audio that the Ordro AC5 has, which is yet another reason that I suspect that this is just the AC5 guts in a different body. The audio has the worst attempt at noise reduction I've ever heard. It results in a surging, whooshing noise that just sounds awful, and that's the same whether you use the built-in mics or an external mic. I suppose in the right situation the results might be good enough, but in a previous video I showed how a 15-year-old Kodak ZI-8 I got used for $20 had better video and audio. And here's a comparison to some 1080p video from a camera I'll talk about later. But this Ordro seems focused on taking pictures, so I'll go over some pictures that I took with this Ordro as well as 2 other cameras. I'll tell what those other cameras were at the end. At a glance, pictures taken with the G700 in good light can look okay. There are situations where I could get a picture with this camera and think, yeah, that's fine. But the colors often end up weird, and when you look a bit closer or compare it to other cameras, it's clear that the Ordro struggles in multiple ways. First, it's nowhere near 64 megapixels. Here's a shot from the Ordro compared to a picture from Mystery Camera 1, which has a 12 megapixel sensor. At first glance, they don't seem too different, but once you zoom in a bit, it's clear that the Ordro has far less detail. It's possible that the Ordro is 8 megapixels, but the detail is further reduced by artifacts, so it looks like even less than 8. There are artifacts from sharpening, compression, and noise reduction. There's also a ton of chromatic aberration from the Ordro. In this picture, in addition to the new spring leaves looking brown and dead in the Ordro pic, the squiggly artifact texture on everything and overdone sharpening and contrast makes it look flat and unnatural. The magenta shift is pretty obvious as well once you put it next to a pic from Mystery Cam 1. The Mystery camera's colors are better, detail is better, and there's less of a flat look to everything. The leaves and branches look almost 3D by comparison, and the little wisps of cloud are smooth and detailed. Again, if you just look at a couple snaps from the Ordro in good light, it doesn't immediately jump out as particularly bad. But throw a couple pics from Mystery Cam 1 in the mix, and the color, detail, and even the auto exposure on the Ordro falls well behind. The Ordro is also terrible in low light. Here's an indoor shot with a third camera thrown into the mix. All struggled here as the lighting was pretty bad, but the Ordro is definitely falling behind the other two cameras. In this next indoor shot, the Ordro wouldn't give me anything but a green image. I tried every white balance mode, and they all looked the same. Camera 2 has much better color, but it still struggled in ways that will become obvious in a moment. Still, it has better color and far better detail than the Ordro. Camera 1 just dominates here. While I took several pics with the others, trying to give them the best shot, to make sure I had the best settings and such, Mystery Camera 1, all I did was point, shoot, and bam, good detail and far better colors first try. I didn't even take a second pic, no need. Camera 1 nailed it on the first try, with no input from me but the shutter button. In good lighting, there's less to differentiate the three cameras, but as we've seen, the Ordro does have the least detail and sometimes odd colors. And through it all, the Ordro was the most annoying to use. It's slower to turn on, much slower to operate overall, it's slower to take follow-up shots, and painfully slow to review images in playback mode. Regardless of the results, the Ordro was more cumbersome and less enjoyable to use than the other two cameras by far. So, what were the mystery cameras? Mystery Camera 2 is actually a phone, and not a high-end one. This is a Samsung A15 that is available currently, brand new, unlocked, for less money than this Ordro. So even if all you want it for is a camera, it's less expensive than the Ordro. It also has a headphone jack, a microphone jack, and an SD card slot. It has a Pro mode that allows manual control for photos, and it's just easier and faster to use than the Ordro, and it has better battery life. And even without a SIM card, you can connect to Wi-Fi for email or even YouTube or other social media to share and upload pics and video. But I get it. It's not a camera, it's a phone. And the whole point of this is that there's still a market for point-and-shoot cameras. So what was Mystery Cam 1? It was this 12-year-old Canon point-and-shoot that I got used at a local camera shop for $100. It is a bit large for a point-and-shoot camera, but it has 50x optical zoom with an electronic viewfinder and optical image stabilization. This 12-year-old camera was so much nicer to use than the Ordro. The focus is nearly instant, and operation overall felt so snappy and intuitive by comparison. Everything about this camera, from the operation, the features, and functionality, just embarrasses the Ordro in every way. I could probably talk for 20 minutes about it, but I will just summarize by saying that this feels like a camera. It feels like it was made by people who know cameras, and it has features that work how camera features should work. On the other hand, the Ordro feels like an imitation of a camera made by people who just want to sell the cheapest thing they can to people who searched camera on the internet. And that's really unfortunate because cameras like Canon, Nikon, Fuji, Panasonic, and others just aren't making small sensor point-and-shoot cameras these days. And it's a shame considering how much better even a 12-year-old well-used Canon is compared to the wave of cheap cameras and camcorders that are flooding the market now. In the end, while I do think you're far better off saving up and getting something better than this Ordro, the point of this video isn't to convince you to go out and spend more. I just wanted to highlight the sad state of cheap cameras right now. We have a market flooded with generic cameras with false specs, non-working features, ads full of lies, and image quality worse than a 12-year-old point-and-shoot. If you feel like one of these generic cameras will work for you and you decide to buy one, I genuinely hope you're happy with it. But personally, I'd recommend getting something else. You could save up a little bit and get something far better, or look around for a deal on a used camera. Or you could do what everyone else is apparently doing and just use your phone. If you have a reasonably modern smartphone, you'll likely get better quality than what you'd get from these generic cameras, and a better experience in use. And even if you don't have a smartphone, you can pick one up for less than the Ordro. And it's not just a better camera, it's also a portable computer, and even a phone. Alright, I've begun taking the camera apart, and I've had to be a little bit more destructive than I'd hoped. There were a couple of solder joints up here between these two boards that I think must have been put on partway through the assembly process, because there doesn't seem to be any way to get this upper small circuit board out with this board in place, and they were soldered together. So I just had to break those 2 solder joints. But once I got this board loose, you can see the first big discovery. There's going to be a big reason for the weight. So a big reason for the weight of this camera is going to be the largest block of metal I've found in any of these cameras. But let me pull that block of metal out and we will see the camera module in front of that. So that is a pretty big block of metal, biggest one I've found in the camera. And for some reason it's painted silver, but you can see it's actually all rusty underneath the paint. And so the paint didn't even stick, and the paint actually stuck to the plastic underneath here. But turns out it's just solid plastic underneath here. So I do see some more screws, so I'll probably have to take this whole front assembly off to actually see the camera module, but I'm going to keep going. All right, if you look down inside there, right about there, you can see the little plastic gear on a little motor that runs on a little gear track on the top of the module. So it's exactly like I said. This inside here is just a small little module out of a camcorder, basically. And here were the ribbon cables that were attached to the board to provide the slack. And the whole thing just slides in and out. So, completely pointless. Like I said, the extension is pointless just for show. The whole thing moves in and out for absolutely no reason. It's not like they didn't have room in here. I mean, the board was back here with this behind it. So you've got like just gaping open nothingness inside of here. Oh, well, except for the block of metal. You can't forget that. That was in there. So it's just basically an empty box of nothing with a super cheap camcorder module inside of it. Everything just designed to look like something it isn't. And lastly, I just wanted to quickly show that even what you can see from here, which looks like this big circuit board, is actually still a lot bigger than it needs to be. Here's the sensor if you're curious about that. And this is the lens module. And you can actually see this inner section is actually all that is the lens module. And this is actually what is in their camcorders. None of this external stuff around it is there. This is all just part of the mechanism that lets it slide in and out. So this whole lens, the only purpose for it is to house this tiny little lens module framing, and that's all that's in the camcorders. Inside this little section, which extends probably to about here, is that 12x optical zoom module, or optical zoom lens. And like I said, all the focusing and zooming is internally, nothing externally has to move, and it's only this big. So this entire lens is just for show. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care. I just wanted to highlight the sad cheap